The town's only doctor was a woman in disguise until the preacher's fever made her choose truth over safety in 1885. The dusty town of Cedar Ridge trusted their lives to Dr. Samuel Hayes, a quiet man with steady hands and few words. But when their beloved preacher lay dying from a fever that wouldn't break, the good doctor's desperate attempt to save him would reveal a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for 5 years. Sometimes the most shocking truth isn't who someone really is. It's how blind we've been to what was right in front of us all along. This is the story of Clara Whitmore, the woman who became a man to heal a world that refused to let her. Settle in, because this tale of courage, deception, and redemption will change how you see the Old West forever. The boy's arm hung wrong, like a broken branch after a storm. Clara could see it from across the dusty street, could see how he held it close to his chest while his mother knelt beside him, her face pale with worry. The child had fallen from the back of a wagon, and now he sat in the dirt outside Miller's store, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. Clara adjusted the beard that scratched against her skin and pulled her hat lower. Dr. Samuel Hayes walked with purpose but never hurried. That was the first rule her father had taught her. A doctor who rushed looked desperate, and desperate men lost the trust of their patients before they ever laid hands on them. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice pitched low and steady. The mother looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "He fell, doctor. His arm, it doesn't look right." Clara knelt in the dust beside the boy. His name was Tommy Miller, 7 years old, with freckles across his nose and eyes that reminded her of her own brother, dead these past 10 years. She had delivered this child into the world, though his mother would never know it was the same hands that caught him then that would heal him now. "Let me take a look, son." Clara's fingers moved gentle as morning mist over the boy's arm. She could feel the break, clean through the bone just above the wrist. Not the worst she'd seen, but painful enough to make a grown man weep. The boy bit his lip and tried not to cry. "You're brave," she told him, and meant it. Braver than most men I know. The crowd that had gathered watched as Dr. Hayes worked. They saw steady hands and quiet confidence. They saw a man who had learned his trade somewhere back east, who had come to their small town 5 years ago with few words and fewer questions about his past. They trusted him because he had earned it, one healing at a time, one life saved after another. They didn't see Clara Whitmore, daughter of Dr. James Whitmore, who had taught her to read the language of broken bones and failing hearts when she was barely tall enough to reach his medicine cabinet. They didn't see the woman who had learned to mix tinctures and set fractures while other girls her age were learning to sew and cook and keep house. Clara splinted the boy's arm with strips of wood and clean cloth. Her movements were sure, practiced. She had done this 100 times or more, first under her father's watchful eye, then alone in the years after he died, and left her with nothing but his knowledge and a world that had no place for a woman who carried it. "Keep this dry," she told the boy's mother. "Come see me in a week, and we'll check how it's healing." The woman pressed coins into her palm, warm for being clutched tight. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes. I don't know what we'd do without you." Clara nodded and turned away before the woman could see the sadness that always followed such words. What would they do without Dr. Samuel Hayes? The same thing they had done before she came. Watch their children suffer, bury their dead, and pray for miracles that never arrived. The afternoon sun beat down merciless as she walked back to her small office behind the barber shop. The building had once housed a dentist who pulled teeth with whiskey for medicine and prayer for comfort. Clara had cleaned the blood from the floors and walls, had scrubbed away the stains of other men's pain until the room smelled of soap and hope instead of fear and death. Inside, she removed her hat and ran fingers through hair that she kept cropped short as a man's. The mirror on the wall showed her the face the world saw, angular, weathered, made harsh by the false whiskers she glued to her chin each morning. But in the quiet moments between patients, she remembered what she had looked like before, when her hair fell long and golden down her back, when her hands had been soft and clean instead of scarred by years of secret practice. She had been 18 when her father died, old enough to know his trade, but too young to inherit his place in the world. The town had mourned Dr. Whitmore had spoken of sending for a replacement from back east, someone trained and proper in mail. Clara had listened to their plans and made her own. She buried her father on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Dr. Samuel Hayes had arrived in town, claiming to have known the old doctor, saying he had come to take over the practice. The lie had grown easier over the years, like a callus that forms to protect soft skin. She wore it now without thinking, moved through her days wrapped in the safety of false identity. But some nights, alone in the dark, she wondered what would happen if the truth ever came to light. Would they forgive her for the deception? Would they remember all the lives she had saved, all the pain she had eased? Or would they see only the lie, the woman who had dared to claim a man's role in their small, ordered world? A knock at her door interrupted these thoughts. Clara quickly replaced her hat and checked that her beard sat straight before opening it. Mrs. Patterson stood there, her face drawn with worry. "Dr. Hayes, you need to come quick. It's Preacher Thomas. He's taken ill, and it's bad." Clara felt her heart skip. Preacher Thomas was a good man, one of the few in town who had ever looked at Dr. Hayes with something approaching friendship, rather than mere professional respect. He was young for a preacher, maybe 35, with kind eyes and a way of speaking that made even the hardest souls feel worthy of salvation. "What are his symptoms?" she asked, already reaching for a medical bag. "Fever, bad shaking, and he's talking out his head. Mrs. Henderson says he's burning up something fierce." Clara followed Mrs. Patterson through the dusty streets toward the small house behind the church where Preacher Thomas lived alone. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. Other townspeople had gathered outside the preacher's house, their faces grim with concern. Inside, the preacher lay on his narrow bed, his face flushed red with fever. Sweat soaked through his nightshirt, and his breathing came quick and shallow. Clara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his forehead. The heat that radiated from his skin was alarming. "How long has he been like this?" she asked Mrs. Henderson, who had been caring for him. "Started this morning. At first, we thought it was just a summer cold, but it got worse fast. He's been saying things, doctor. Strange things." Clara began her examination, checking the preacher's pulse, listening to his breathing, looking for clues in the flush of his skin and the pattern of his fever. This was familiar territory, the careful detective work of diagnosis, the weighing of symptoms against knowledge, the race against time to find an answer before the body gave up its fight. But as she worked, something nagged at her. There was something about the way the fever presented, something about the delirium that followed patterns she remembered from her father's old journals. A sickness that came on fast and burned hot, that made strong men weak in a matter of hours. "Has anyone else in town taken ill?" she asked. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Just him, far as we know." Clara frowned. An isolated case, then, which ruled out many of the contagious diseases that swept through frontier towns like wildfire. This was something else, something that required careful thought and precise treatment. She opened her medical bag and began mixing a tincture to bring down the fever. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, measuring drops and powders, creating the remedies her father had taught her. But even as she worked, she could feel the weight of the townspeople's eyes upon her, could sense their hope and their fear hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Preacher Thomas shifted restlessly on his bed, mumbling words that made no sense. Clara leaned closer to listen, trying to understand what his fevered mind was trying to tell her. Most delirium was meaningless, fragments of memory and fear tangled together without purpose. But sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could learn things that helped with the healing. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Clara," the preacher whispered, his eyes closed, his voice barely audible. "Clara Whitmore, I remember your father's hands, so gentle, like yours." Clara's hand froze above her medicine bottles. No one in this town knew that name. No one should know that name. She glanced quickly around the room, but the others seemed not to have heard, their attention focused on their prayers and their worry. But she had heard, and suddenly, the weight of her secret felt heavier than it ever had before. Preacher Thomas knew who she really was, somehow, some way. The question now was whether he would remember when the fever broke and what he would do with that knowledge if he did. The sun had fully set now, and lamplight flickered across the walls of the small room. Clara continued her work, mixing medicines and checking symptoms, but her mind raced with questions and fears. How did he know? What would happen if he spoke her real name when others could hear? As she measured out another dose of fever medicine, Clara realized that she stood at a crossroads. She could continue as she had, hiding behind the safety of Dr. Samuel Hayes, or she could face whatever truth was coming. Either way, something told her that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. By midnight, Preacher Thomas was dying. Clara could see it in the way his breathing had grown shallow, and how his skin burned dry as desert sand despite the cool cloths she pressed to his forehead. The fever had climbed past what most men could survive, and still it rose. She had moved him from his small house to the church itself, laying him on blankets spread before the altar. The church was cooler, and somehow it felt right that if he was going to die, it should be in the place he loved most. The townspeople filled the wooden pews, their heads bowed in prayer. Their voices rose and fell like wind through wheat, a constant murmur that should have been comforting but only reminded Clara how alone she was in this fight. They could pray all they wanted, but prayer wouldn't break a fever. Only knowledge could do that, and the knowledge she needed was locked away in memories of her father's journals, pages she had read by lamplight years ago when she was still learning the difference between healing and hoping. She recognized this sickness now. Mountain fever, her father had called it, though it had other names in other places. She had seen it only once before, when she was 16 and still openly her father's daughter. A traveling merchant had brought it to their town, and her father had fought it the same way she fought it now, with willow bark tea and cool baths, with careful attention to the heart's rhythm and the lung struggle. The merchant had lived, but barely. Clara knelt beside the preacher's makeshift bed, checking his pulse again. It fluttered like a bird trapped in a cage, too fast and too weak. His skin had taken on a gray cast that she knew meant his body was losing the battle. She had perhaps an hour, maybe two, before the choice would be taken from her entirely. "Dr. Hayes," came a whisper from behind her. She turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's housekeeper, holding a cup of fresh water. "How is he?" Clara accepted the cup, but didn't answer directly. What could she say? That she had seen this disease kill strong men in half a day? That the medicines she had weren't quite right, weren't the exact mixture her father had used? That she was working from memory of things read years ago, and memory could be a liar when lives hung in the balance? "Keep praying," she said instead, and meant it. Sometimes prayer was all that stood between hope and despair, even when the one asking for miracles didn't fully believe in them herself. Mrs. Patterson nodded and returned to her pew, leaving Clara alone with her patient and her fears. She dipped a cloth in the cool water and placed it across the preacher's forehead. His skin was so hot it seemed to steam in the dim candlelight. That was when he spoke again. "Clara," his voice was barely a breath, but in the quiet church it sounded loud as thunder. "Clara Whitmore, I remember your hands, gentle like your father's." Clara's blood turned to ice. She glanced quickly over her shoulder, but the congregation was deep in prayer, their own voices covering his words. Still, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped animal. How many times could she be lucky? How long before someone heard? She leaned close to his ear, her voice urgent and low. "Be quiet, Thomas. You don't know what you're saying." But the fever had him in its grip, and fever told its own truth. His eyes opened, unfocused and bright with sickness, but somehow they found her face beneath the false beard and the pulled low hat. "I know you," he whispered, and his voice carried the certainty of delirium. "I've always known you." Even when you came to town dressed as a man. Even when you saved my horse that first winter. I knew those hands. Clara's world tilted like a wagon with a broken wheel. He had known. For 5 years, he had known who she really was, and he had said nothing, had done nothing, had simply watched her heal his people and kept her secret safe. The realization should have brought relief, but instead it brought terror. Because if the fever made him speak truth, what other truths might spill from his lips? And what would happen when the townspeople heard? She mixed another dose of willow bark tea, her hands shaking now as they hadn't when she was treating broken bones or birthing babies. The stakes had never been higher. If Thomas died, she lost one of the few people in the world who had ever truly seen her. If he lived but spoke her name where others could hear, she lost everything she had built. "Drink this," she urged, holding the cup to his cracked lips. The bitter tea ran down his chin more than into his mouth, but some of it went where it needed to go. "Fight, Thomas. You have to fight." Behind her, the prayers continued. Old Mrs. Henderson's voice rose above the others, pleading with the Almighty to spare their preacher. Young Billy Morrison wept openly, remembering perhaps how Preacher Thomas had sat with him when his own father died. The whole town was here, it seemed, united in their love for this man who had brought them comfort in their darkest hours. And Clara was the only thing standing between him and death. She checked his pulse again. Still too fast, but perhaps not as weak as before. The fever might have peaked, or might be gathering strength for one final assault on his failing body. She couldn't tell yet. She could only wait and watch and hope that her medicines were strong enough. "Tell me about your father." The words were so clear, so lucid, that for a moment Clara thought the fever had broken. But when she looked at Thomas's face, his eyes were still closed, still lost in whatever dreams or memories the sickness had brought him. "What?" she whispered. "Your father. Dr. James Whitmore. Tell me about him." Thomas's voice was stronger now, but still caught in the web of delirium. "He was a good man. Taught you everything he knew. Didn't care what the world thought about women learning healing. Said hands were hands, and good ones were rare." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. These weren't the ramblings of fever. These were memories, specific and detailed. But memories of what? When had Preacher Thomas ever met her father? He used to say, Thomas continued, his voice growing distant, he used to say that medicine was about seeing what others missed. About looking past what people showed you and finding what they needed. Like looking past a girl child and seeing a healer. Like looking past a lie and seeing the love that built it. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Those were her father's words, spoken in his voice, with his particular way of mixing philosophy with practical wisdom. But how could Thomas know them? How could he know any of this? She thought back to those days before her father died, tried to remember if there had been a young preacher among the people who came seeking healing. But the years had blurred together, and there had been so many faces, so many stories of pain and hope. "I was different then," Thomas murmured, and now his eyes opened, looking directly at her with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. "Younger, angrier, came to your father's house with a bullet in my shoulder and hate in my heart. Said I was a circuit rider, but I wasn't riding for God then. Was riding from the law, from my own sins, from everything I'd done wrong." Clara's breath caught. She did remember now, a young man, maybe 25, with wild eyes and careful hands. He had been shot in a card game gone bad, had ridden for days to reach her father's house because someone in the last town had told him Dr. Whitmore would heal anyone who asked, no questions and no judgments. "You were the gambler," she said, the memory coming back clear and sharp. "The one who stayed 2 weeks while the wound healed. I was a lot of things then. None of them good." Thomas's voice was fading again, the fever pulling him back under. "But your father, he didn't see what I'd been. He saw what I could be. And you were just a girl then, but you had his eyes. Seeing past the surface, seeing what mattered." Clara remembered that time now, remembered how her father had made the young stranger welcome, had let him sleep in their barn and eat at their table while his shoulder healed. She remembered watching from the kitchen window as her father changed the man's bandages, how he had talked to him not about his sins, but about his choices, about the roads that led away from darkness. "He changed my life," Thomas whispered, "made me believe I could be more than what I was. When I left your house, I rode straight to the nearest town with a church and asked the preacher there how a man goes about serving God instead of serving himself. The fever claimed him again then, pulling him back into delirium, but the damage was done." Clara understood now why he had recognized her, why he had kept her secret. He owed her father a debt that could never be repaid, and protecting his daughter was the only payment he could offer. But understanding brought no comfort. Because if Thomas remembered all this, if his fever was pulling up memories from 15 years ago, what else might he remember? What else might he say? As if in answer to her fears, Thomas began to speak again, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet church. "Clara saved my horse," he said, loud enough that several heads turned in the pews. "First winter she came to town. Ice storm, and my mare went down with a colic. Doc Hayes worked all night in the barn, hands gentle as any woman's." Clara's heart stopped. This was it, the moment she had feared for 5 years. She looked around the church and saw confused faces, saw people beginning to listen more carefully to the preacher's fevered words. "Hands like her father's," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "James Whitmore had the gentlest hands, taught his daughter everything. Clara, sweet Clara." The church fell silent except for the sound of Thomas's labored breathing and Clara's racing heart. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense the questions forming in their minds. Who was Clara? Why was the preacher speaking of a woman's hands when only Dr. Hayes had been in the barn that night? Mrs. Patterson was the first to speak. "Dr. Hayes," she said carefully, "who is Clara?" Clara looked down at Thomas, at the man whose life hung in the balance of her next choice. She could lie, could claim he was speaking nonsense, could blame the fever for words that made no sense. She had built her life on one lie. What was one more? But as she knelt there in the candlelight, surrounded by people who had trusted Dr. Samuel Hayes with their lives and their children's lives, Clara realized that some truths were stronger than the lies that tried to bury them. And perhaps, after all these years of hiding, the time had come to let the truth breathe free. She reached up and removed her hat, letting her short hair catch the flickering light. Then, with steady hands, she began to peel away the false beard that had hidden her face for so long. The gasp from the congregation sounded like whine through broken windows, sharp and sudden and full of shock. But Clara kept working, kept revealing, until finally she looked up at them with her true face bare to their judgment. "My name," she said, her voice clear and calm, "is Clara Whitmore, and I'm going to save your preacher's life." The silence that followed Clara's revelation stretched like a hell breath. She knelt beside Thomas, her true face bare to the candlelight, and waited for the storm she was certain would come. Anger, perhaps. Accusations. Demands that she leave their town and never return. Instead, old Mrs. Henderson rose from her pew and walked slowly down the aisle. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet church like distant thunder. She stopped beside Clara and looked down at her with eyes that had seen 70 years of joy and sorrow, of secrets kept and truths revealed. "Well," she said finally, her voice soft as worn cotton, "that explains why Dr. Hayes never could grow a proper beard." A sound escaped Clara's throat, half laugh, half sob. She had expected condemnation, but here was something she had never dared hope for, understanding touched with gentle humor. "How long have you known?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Henderson smiled and settled herself on the floor beside them, her old bones creaking like barn doors. "Known for certain?" "Just now." "Suspected?" "Oh, child, I've birthed 8 babies and raised 6 to adulthood. I know the difference between a man's hands and a woman's hands, beard or no beard." Thomas stirred on his makeshift bed, his fever bright, eyes opening to focus on Clara's face. For a moment, she thought the crisis had passed, that he might be himself again. But then he spoke, and she knew he was still lost in the maze of memory and sickness. "You were 14, he said, his voice clear but distant. 14 years old, and you set my broken finger straighter than any doctor I'd met before or since." Clara remembered. It had been his first week at their homestead, and he had caught his hand in the barn door while helping her father tend to his wounded shoulder. She had been the one to notice the finger was broken, had been the one to splint it with strips of cloth and bits of kindling, while her father watched approvingly. "I was so scared," she whispered, the memory washing over her like cool water. "I'd never worked on anyone but animals before." "You hummed while you worked," Thomas continued, his eyes seeing not the church around them, but something 15 years past. "Some little tune your mother taught you. Said it kept your hands steady." Clara's breath caught. She had forgotten about the humming, forgotten how her mother's lullabies had calmed her nerves during those early days of learning. But Thomas remembered. Even through the haze of fever and pain, he remembered. "Mrs." Henderson reached out and took Clara's hand in her own weathered fingers. "Tell us about those days, child. Help us understand." So Clara began to speak, her voice low and careful at first, then growing stronger as the words found their rhythm. She told them about her father's house on the prairie, how it sat alone under the big sky with nothing but grassland stretching to the horizon. She told them about the people who came seeking healing, travelers and settlers, cowboys and farmers, anyone who had heard that DR. James Whitmore would tend their hurts without asking questions about their ability to pay. "Father said medicine belonged to anyone willing to learn it," Clara said, her fingers working automatically to check Thomas's pulse as she spoke. "He didn't care that I was a girl. Said healing was about seeing what was broken and knowing how to fix it, and that kind of seeing didn't depend on what was between your legs." Thomas's breathing had grown easier as she talked, his fever finally beginning to break. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but it was the good sweat of a body winning its battle, not the dry heat of approaching death. "He was a good man, your father," Thomas said, and now his voice carried the weight of full consciousness, of fever lifting like fog before the morning sun. "Found me half dead on his doorstep, bullet wound going bad, and he never once asked who put the bullet there or why." Clara smiled at the memory. He said a man's past was his own business, but his future was God's concern, and God's concern was keeping him alive long enough to make better choices. The church had grown quiet around them, the congregation listening to this conversation between past and present, between the woman they had known as a man and the preacher who had kept her secret. Some had left when Clara revealed herself. She could hear the sound of boots on wooden steps, of doors closing with finality. But many had stayed, drawn perhaps by curiosity or by the realization that their healer was still their healer, regardless of the name she carried. Thomas struggled to sit up, and Clara helped him, arranging pillows behind his back. His color was better now, the gray pallor of near death replaced by the flush of returning health. "I watched you work," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Watched you mix medicines and stitch wounds and deliver babies. You were just a child, but you had the surest hands I'd ever seen. And your father, he was so proud. Not ashamed, like some men would be. Proud that his daughter could heal." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. Those had been good days, before the world taught her that a woman's healing touch was somehow less valuable than a man's. Before she learned that knowledge and skill mattered less than the shape of your body or the pitch of your voice. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked gently. "To your father?" Heart gave out, Clara said simply. "One day he was fine, teaching me about fevers and infections. The next morning, I found him in his chair by the window, gone peaceful in his sleep." "Mrs." Henderson made a soft sound of sympathy. Around them, the other townspeople leaned closer, caught up now in the story of their doctor's hidden past. "I was 18, Clara continued, old enough to know everything he had taught me, but not old enough to inherit his practice. The town council made it clear that they would be sending for a proper doctor, a man, to replace him. So you became one," Thomas said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. "I became what they needed me to be." Clara's voice was steady now, sure of her choices even if she was uncertain of their consequences. I buried Clara Whitmore with her father and became Dr. Samuel Hayes. It was the only way to keep healing, to keep using what I'd learned. Thomas reached out and touched her hand with fingers that were steady now, no longer shaking with fever. And you've saved how many lives in these 5 years? How many children born safely? How many fevers broken? How many bones set straight? Clara didn't answer, couldn't answer. The number was too large, too precious to speak aloud. I kept your secret, Thomas said, because I knew what you were risking. I knew what it meant for you to hide who you were so you could be who these people needed. He looked around the church then, at the faces that watched them in the candlelight. Some were curious, some confused, some disapproving. But most, Clara realized with surprise, looked simply grateful. Grateful that their preacher lived, grateful that their doctor, whatever name she carried, had saved him. I should have told you, Thomas said, his voice carrying regret. Should have let you know that someone in this town saw you truly. But I was afraid that if I spoke of it, even to you, the secret might somehow escape. Clara shook her head. You kept me safe. That was enough. The fever was fully broken now, she could tell. Thomas's breathing was deep and even his skin cool to the touch. The medicines had done their work, guided by knowledge passed down from father to daughter, from teacher to student, from one healer to another across the years. Will you stay? Thomas asked quietly. Now that they know, Clara looked around the church, at the faces that watched her with expressions ranging from acceptance to uncertainty to something that might have been respect. She thought of the life she had built here, of the trust she had earned one patient at a time, one crisis weathered, one life saved. She thought of the boy with the broken arm, of Mrs. Patterson's gratitude, of all the times someone had pressed coins into Dr. Samuel Hayes' palm and whispered thanks for healing that had made the difference between hope and despair. I don't know, she said honestly. That's not my choice alone anymore. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll find out together what grace looks like in the morning light. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. The long night was ending, and with it, the fever that had nearly claimed one life and revealed another. Clara sat beside Thomas in the growing light, her true face bare to the world at last, and wondered what the new day would bring to a woman who had spent 5 years hiding in the shadow of the man she pretended to be. The first full light of dawn came through the church windows like water through a broken dam, washing everything in gold and making the night's revelations seem both more real and more impossible. Clara sat beside Thomas, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders like a heavy coat, watching the rise and fall of his chest with the careful attention of someone who had spent the night wrestling death for a man's soul. His fever had broken completely now. She could see it in the healthy color that had returned to his skin, in the way his breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of true rest rather than the shallow gasps of sickness. But more than that, she could see it in his eyes when they opened, clear now, fully present, no longer lost in the maze of delirium. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, taking in her face without the false beard, her hair cropped short but undeniably feminine in the morning light. A slow smile spread across his features, tired but genuine. Clara Whitmore, he said, and his voice carried across the church with the clarity of a bell. Not fevered rambling now, but deliberate speech meant to be heard. I should have said your name properly years ago. The remaining townspeople, perhaps 24, had stayed through the night, stirred in their pews. Clara felt their attention focus on her like sunlight through a magnifying glass, intense and impossible to escape. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she found she was no longer afraid. The worst had happened. Her secret was out, her true face revealed, and the world had not ended. Thomas lived, and she was still herself, still the person who had learned healing at her father's knee and practiced it with steady hands for 5 long years. Mrs. Henderson rose from her place on the floor, her joints creaking with age and the long night's vigil. She looked around at the congregation with the authority of someone who had been part of this community since before most of them were born. "I think," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom, "that we owe Dr. Whitmore, Clara, some words of our own." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of the night before. This was thoughtful, considering the sound of minds changing and hearts opening to possibility they had never imagined. Young Billy Morrison was the first to speak. He was maybe 20, with the calloused hands of a man who worked the land and the serious eyes of someone who had seen too much loss too early. His father had died 2 winters ago, and Clara remembered sitting with the family through that long, cold night, doing everything she could until there was nothing left to do but hold his mother while she wept. Dr. Hayes, Clara. He stumbled over the name, then found his footing. "Clara, you saved my pa that winter he got sick. Sat with us for 3 days, barely slept, barely ate. Don't much matter to me what name you go by or what clothes you wear. You're still the person who fought for him, who gave us 3 more months with him before the lung fever finally won." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She remembered those months, how precious they had been to Billy and his mother, how they had made peace with each other and with the dying that was coming. Old Tom Miller stood up slowly, leaning heavy on his walking stick. "This woman delivered my grandson," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Brought him into the world when the midwife said both him and my daughter-in-law were going to die. Worked all night, hands steady as stone, never once gave up hope." He looked directly at Clara, and she saw acceptance in his weathered features. "Don't care if she calls herself Samuel or Clara or anything else. She's got the hands of a healer, and that's what matters." One by one, others began to speak. They told stories Clara had almost forgotten. The farmer whose infected wound she had cleaned and stitched, the woman whose difficult birth she had managed with patience and skill, the children whose fever she had broken with willow bark tea and steady care. Each story was a thread in a tapestry she hadn't realized she was weaving, a pattern of trust and healing that had grown over 5 years of quiet service. But not everyone spoke with acceptance. Jacob Morrison, Billy's uncle, stood up with his face hard as granite. "This is all well and good," he said, his voice sharp with disapproval. "But the fact remains that this woman has been lying to us for 5 years. How do we know what else she's been lying about? How do we know we can trust anything she's told us?" A murmur ran through the congregation, and Clara felt her heart sink. This was what she had feared, that the deception would poison everything else, would make people question not just her identity, but her skill, her judgment, her every word and action. But Thomas struggled to sit up straighter, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of his calling, the weight of a man who had just looked death in the eye and lived to tell about it. "Jacob Morrison," he said, "let me tell you about trust. 15 years ago, I came to the house of Dr. James Whitmore with a bullet in my shoulder and blood on my hands. I was running from the law and from myself, and I had no claim on anyone's kindness. But that good man took me in, healed my wound, and never asked me a single question about what I'd done or who I was running from." Thomas paused, gathering strength, and Clara could see him choosing his words with the care of a preacher who understood the power of testimony. "And his daughter, this woman here, she was 14 years old, but she had hands that could gentle a wild horse or set a broken bone with equal skill. She saw me not as an outlaw or a sinner, but as someone who needed healing. And when I left their house 2 weeks later, I rode not to the next town with a card game and a bottle, but to the nearest church, where I asked how a man goes about serving God instead of serving his own dark appetites." The church was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on Thomas's words. "You want to know about trust?" Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'll tell you about trust. This woman has kept your children alive, has eased your pain, has sat with you in your darkest hours, and asked for nothing but the chance to help. She lied about her name, yes, but she told the truth with her hands, with her skill, with her heart. And I would rather have a healer who lies about being a woman than no healer at all." Clara felt something break open in her chest, some tight, not of fear and shame that had been wound there for years. To hear Thomas speak her truth, to see the faces around her softening from suspicion to something approaching understanding. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's housekeeper, stood up and smoothed her skirts with deliberate care. "I've been thinking all night," she said, "about all the times Dr. Hayes, Clara, came to help when folks were sick or hurt. And you know what I remember? I remember gentle hands and a quiet voice. I remember someone who listened when I told her about my symptoms, who explained what she was doing and why. I remember feeling safe, feeling cared for." She looked directly at Clara. "Those things don't change just because I know your real name now." Jacob Morrison shook his head stubbornly. "It's not right. A woman practicing medicine, pretending to be a man. It goes against the natural order of things. And what's natural about letting people suffer when there's someone willing and able to help them?" This from Sarah Chun, whose difficult pregnancy Clara had managed just 6 months ago. "Clara delivered my baby when the midwife was away helping someone else. Sat with me for 18 hours, never left my side, talked me through every pain. My son is alive because of her skill, and I don't care what she wears or what name she goes by." The debate might have continued, but Thomas raised his hand, and his authority as their spiritual leader quieted the voices. "Friends," he said, "I think the question before us isn't whether Clara Whitmore has the right to practice medicine. The question is whether we have the right to deny ourselves the best healer we've ever had just because she's not what we expected." He struggled to stand, and Clara moved to help him, steadying him with a hand on his arm. In the morning light streaming through the windows, they made an unlikely pair. The young preacher still weak from fever, and the woman doctor who had saved his life. "I propose," Thomas said, "that we judge Clara not by the deception she felt necessary to practice her calling, but by the fruits of that practice. How many of us are alive today because of her skill? How many of our children have been born safely into her hands? How many times has she eased our pain and asked for nothing in return but the chance to help?" Clara looked around the church and saw faces she had known for 5 years, people she had helped through sickness and injury and childbirth. But now she was seeing them clearly for the first time, and they were seeing her the same way. The masks were off on both sides. "I know I deceived you," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "I know I let you believe I was someone I wasn't. But I want you to know why." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "When my father died, I had 2 choices. I could let his knowledge die with him, or I could find a way to keep using it to help people. The world told me that healing was man's work, that a woman's hands weren't suitable for medicine. But my hands knew how to set bones and deliver babies and fight fevers. My mind knew how to read symptoms and mix medicines and make the choices that mean the difference between life and death." She looked directly at Jacob Morrison, the man who had questioned her right to practice. "You're right that I lied, but I lied so I could keep healing. I lied so your grandson could be born safely when his mother was struggling. I lied so Billy's father could have those last precious months with his family. I lied because the truth would have meant watching people suffer when I had the knowledge to help them." Clara removed her hat completely now, running her fingers through hair that had been hidden for so long. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 28 years old, and I have been practicing medicine since I was 16. I learned everything I know from my father, Dr. James Whitmore, who believed that healing belonged to anyone willing to dedicate their life to it. I have delivered 37 babies, set more bones than I can count, and sat with more dying people than anyone should have to. And if you'll let me, I'll keep doing it, no longer hiding behind a false name or a fake beard, but as myself, as who I really am." The silence that followed felt different from all the others. This one was full of decision, of minds being made and hearts being opened. Clara waited, her true face bare to the light for their judgment. It was little Tommy Miller who broke the silence. The boy whose arm she had set just the day before wriggled out of his mother's grasp and ran down the aisle. He stopped in front of Clara and looked up at her with eyes wide with curiosity but not fear. "Are you still going to be our doctor?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Clara knelt down to his level, bringing herself eye to eye with the child. If your parents want me to be, yes. Tommy nodded seriously. Good. My arm feels much better now. You have very gentle hands. Out of the mouths of babes, Mrs. Henderson said softly, and Clara heard the smile in her voice. One by one, the townspeople began to file past them. Some stopped to shake her hand, to thank her for years of quiet service, to tell her that names and clothes mattered less than skill and compassion. Others nodded politely and left without speaking, their feelings still tangled and uncertain. A few left without acknowledgement at all, and Clara knew those relationships would need time to heal, if they ever could. But more stayed than left. More offered acceptance than condemnation. And when the church was finally empty except for herself, Thomas, and Mrs. Henderson, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. The simple peace of being known. What happens now? She asked Thomas as she helped him to his feet. He smiled, still weak, but growing stronger by the hour. Now we go on. You practice medicine, I preach sermons, and the people of Cedar Ridge get used to the idea that their doctor is a woman named Clara instead of a man named Samuel. It won't be easy, Mrs. Henderson warned. Some folks don't change their minds quick. Some never change them at all. Clara nodded. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead. But she also knew that she was done hiding, done pretending to be someone she wasn't. The truth was out now, bright as the morning sun, and there was no going back into shadow. I know, she said, but for the first time in 5 years, I won't have to face those challenges alone. She looked around the church one last time, at the place where her secret had been born and died in the space of a single night. The golden light streaming through the windows seemed to promise better days ahead, days when Clara Whitmore could practice medicine as herself, with her own name and her own face, no longer hidden behind the safety of deception. Thomas was right. The light that cannot hide had found her at last, and she was finally ready to step into it. Outside, Cedar Ridge was waking up to a new day, and to the knowledge that their doctor was not who they had thought. But as Clara walked out into the morning sun, her medical bag in one hand and her discarded hat in the other, she knew that some things were more important than expectations or conventions. Healing was healing, no matter whose hand performed it. And Clara Whitmore had hands that could heal,